With the exception of some historians of philosophy, I think you're the first philosopher I've spoken with on the show who works more squarely in the continental tradition than the analytic tradition. And I can already tell that not just because you've mentioned phenomenology, but the way that you talk about philosophy. Like when you say you were cast into a very vast and deep ocean and you needed philosophy to help you find a footing. A logician doesn't really talk about their philosophical work in quite this way or navigating the choppy waters. But I'm curious, like I said, I haven't talked to a continental philosopher about this. Just how do you conceive of the difference between the continental and analytic traditions? And what attracted you to work in the continental side?
Oh wow, that takes me a long way back. I mean, back in the 1990s, there was this big. Don't know. Actually, I don't know if it was big, and I don't know if it was particularly meaningful. A sort of perceived divide between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, and I think that kind of distinction really just shortchanges all parties to the debate. Um, there are different styles of writing for sure. They come or rely upon different traditions. But in a way, the questions they want to answer, the philosophical issues they grapple with, are the universal ones that I don't think any philosophers would disagree on. Questions about meaning, questions about value, and then obviously all the specific, philosophical disciplines relating to, the special sciences and, philosophy of science and so on. I don't think it's a hugely useful distinction.
Okay.
I think, most philosophers really appreciate clarity. Um, and that's something that in some styles of continental writing is is more tricky to obtain. But I think now we have such a rich secondary literature, say on Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, or Husserl, where I guess philosophers who are kind of analytically trained or write in a very clear manner, like say Dan Zahavi or Matthew Radcliffe, write in a very very clear and accessible to the Anglo-American ear. I think write about these ideas from that perspective. So I don't know that thinking in those terms has been hugely fruitful. I'm trying to think of back to the 90s and how people maybe felt they had to sort of align with one side in the divide. I don't think that was particularly fruitful, and I think there are um, a lot of philosophers who had an interest in both, or had an interest maybe in logic and in political philosophy, or in philosophy of maths and history of philosophy. There's
Hmm.
there's no we don't need to restrict ourselves in what we choose to take an interest in. So I think rightly, in my opinion, that kind of divided has more or less kind of stopped being mentioned and isn't really much of a. I haven't come across in recent years people writing about it and saying that it's a very interesting or a very pertinent distinction to make, say within philosophy.
Well, since you just mentioned Husserl, one last question I have, maybe before we get into some of the specifics. Uh, I'd like to talk about a bit about phenomenology, which you describe as a philosophical approach that studies how we encounter the world and other people. And my only experience with phenomenology is a couple of lectures I sat in on about Husserl, where I mean, what I got out of this, because it was a few years ago, and I only lasted a couple lectures, even though I still thought it was very interesting. Well, I took phenomenology to be quite basically an investigation into how we perceive and experience the world that takes as given. I guess this is sort of repetitive, only our experience, but only maybe our sense data or our feelings, this sort of thing, rather than trying to draw upon science, logic, or other, I guess, yeah, other domains of knowledge. Can you tell me how close that is to how you conceive of phenomenology and maybe how it's changed since Husserl?
Yeah. So I think again, going back to or thinking about unhelpful divides, there's
Hmm.
this, I guess, this idea that if you champion experience and perception in the everyday sense of experience and perception, then you're somehow devaluing science. And again, I don't think that's true at all. I think one argument made by Husserl, for example, and other phenomenologists, is to say we shouldn't take for granted the primacy of the scientific or objective or third person point of view. Now, they're not engaged, they're not epistemologists, they're not asking where does knowledge come from, even though that's a valuable question in its own right. I think what they're trying to do is to say when we look at what a human being is, what it does, what we do primarily is experience and perceive. And how we, that juncture of perception in the world, or how we come, consciousness comes to encounter the world and to encounter other consciousnesses, is the basic stuff of phenomenology. The idea, or one idea that Husserl had, at least in part of his career, was the idea that we don't need to consider the reality of objects outside ourselves, primarily because that is the realm of the sciences. So you say, oh, what is this cup? What is it made of? Atoms or whatever. That's a sort of empirical question. But the philosophical question, or the transcendental question, would be: how does consciousness need to be set up in order to allow me to perceive that thing as an object? So you're bracketing, if you like, the whole debate about the reality of the objects or the reality of the external world in favor of the focus on how that perception, that encounter takes place. Now, again, you could say, well, that's also an empirical encounter, that's also an empirical investigation. But philosophers, phenomenologists distinguish themselves from psychologists because they're not interested in the empirical how, the mechanics of, say, visual perception, right? That's what empirical psychologists do. Rather, they're interested in what what are the conditions of possibility, if you like, for that kind of perceptual act to take place. So it's transcendental in that sense. It's non-empirical in that sense, and it really tries to cash out, I think, the domain of everyday life that is very much kind of worthy of examination.
Hmm.
So I think philosophy, if you go back, I don't know, 100 years and a bit, was much more closely aligned to psychology before empirical psychology was as developed as it is today. And I think that basic idea that we should be metaphysically modest and we should study phenomena, we should study things as they appear to us, and leave the study of what those things really are to scientists. I think that's a kind of legitimate phenomenological motivation, and, if you like, a kind of the very kind of rough outline of what a phenomenological project might look like.
Yeah, no, I sympathize with that as well. There's one important word you used a couple of times that I want to make sure that I understand what it means, and it's transcendental. I think like one thing you said was you called it the transcendental question, how um, consciousness has to be set up for us to perceive the external world. Maybe I got some words wrong, but is from context, I'm just gathering that transcendental has to do with the mind uh, transcending some divide between us and the world and getting at the world. Is that what transcendental refers to? Something like that?
A little bit different. I mean, that would be
Okay.
transcendent. Transcendental means it has to do with the conditions of possibility. So, very, very similar to kind of the Kantian project of saying, what has to be in place for us to experience the world? And the answer, well, space and time. So transcendental has to do with a set of kind of preliminary questions of what are the conditions that enable us to, say, experience the world in a certain way or to have certain perceptions. So again, the kind of one type of response would be to say, well, we have to be able to experience things within space and within time. And there's lots of other similar responses that kind of cash it out a lot more. But I think really the idea of the phenomenology, it started from this kind of transcendental project, if you like, but then other strands kind of came into existence that you could call applied phenomenology, embodied phenomenology, phenomenology that very much focuses on first-person experiences as being particularly significant for particular aspects. So, for example, in my work, I'm very interested in the experience of illness, of how people experience their own illness from the first-person perspective, but I'm also interested in how people experience the illness of close ones, so from the second-person perspective, and certainly how the third-person perspective, if you like, of medical science has this kind of ongoing interplay with these two perspectives. I think that's useful when we try to understand not just what it feels like for me, qua the ill person, but also what it feels like for the physician who is looking after me, for the person who cares for me and my family, and so on. So I think really interesting things came out of phenomenology as a tool, if you like, for the study of particular human experiences. Now, there's some people who are saying, this is so far removed from the original Husserlian project that you shouldn't really call it phenomenology, or that it's been watered down, or that it's nothing more than what you do anyway in qualitative research. You ask people, what was it like for you? I don't have a strong view. I mean, I think the one thing that phenomenology does, which qualitative health research, for example, doesn't do, is give you concepts with which to understand and study the experience of illness. So there are important differences. But I do think that in this kind of applied form, I think there's a very powerful kind of framework or research kind of setup that privileges the first person experience, that wants to study the reality of that experience in as much detail as possible, and is hence maybe, useful as an empirical method, but also is very rich in its concepts. And I think that's the thing that makes philosophical phenomenology, as some people call it, very, very, very potent.